Good afternoon and welcome to Bookworms. Bookworms is the show where a plucky bunch of radio types take to the airwaves to discuss books that we've read or things that have interested us in the kind of field of literature. And tonight, this afternoon even, oh my gosh, it's mid-afternoon now. It's Lucy Cooper, that's me, and Graham Bernard. Hello.
Hello, Lucy.
How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Lovely to be here with you. And it only feels like a few weeks ago I was here with Anne Rainford, who is another member of our team. I think, how many of us are there?
Six.
There you are. And so this show is on every fortnight and is repeated. So we get a new show every fortnight, but we're repeated in between. So there's always Bookworms. Always you will have worms on 92.7 FM RFN, your community access radio station. So it's really nice to be here with you, Graham. And we've both bought quite different books, but both pertaining to the historical. And I think we're going to kickstart with you because you also very flash because you've got a family relation on the front of your books. Tell us about what you're going to read to us today.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm going to read from a book that no one has probably ever heard of, written by someone who no one has probably ever heard of. He only ever wrote one book, and that was only because his son pestered him to write it.
Right.
And this man is my uncle, my mother's brother. And the book is called Campbell Island, and he led a meteorological team down there in 1955 and 56, and then he went back for 2 years, 58 to 60. Right. And that's him there on the back.
Very handsome fella. What a great beard.
Yes, it was. Yeah. And I think he grew that down there because I don't ever remember him with a beard.
Oh, okay.
I think it was part of the uniform.
Yeah, must have been.
This was 500 miles south of New Zealand in the subantarctic. So
right.
Campbell Island.
You're going to need a beard.
He didn't even know where it was when he got the job. After he'd been given the job, he then said, well, where is it?
Oh,
I think he thought it was in Wellington Harbour somewhere. But,
oh, wow.
So the book's quite technical, but I want to read the part from when it first begins, when he first gets the job.
Yep.
And also just some little bits which I think are lovely and pertain to his character. And every time I read them, I think, yeah, that's him.
Oh, how delightful.
He was a very hard man. On the outside, he had the skin of a rhinoceros, and on the inside, he was marshmallow. Oh. He absolutely loved his family. He loved my mother, his sister, and he was fiercely loyal to family, but tough. He'd been fighting in Korea, and he was a tough man.
Wow.
But we loved him.
Lived a life.
He died about 10 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So how old was he when he died?
86.
God, so he lived a long life. Yeah. Lovely.
He did. And his wife died just last year.
Oh.
Yes.
Beautiful.
And she was my very last one of that generation. So I have no uncles and aunties left now. She was the last auntie to go. So, yeah.
And how lovely that, relatives leaving behind legacies like books. Isn't that wonderful?
It is. And if anyone's sort of intrigued more about this after I've read it, I did buy a copy and leave it at the library here. So,
wonderful.
Just as a gift from the family. So if anyone's interested in Campbell Island, you won't know more about it than what's in this book. So he starts off, the story begins, and I'm just going to read a short bit from when he first got the job. I returned from Korea in late 1954 and mooched around Rotorua doing odd jobs, eventually ending up as a technician with the DSIR. This didn't prove to my liking, too slow and not productive enough for someone with energy to burn. However, it was work and money. One morning I was checking through the Government Gazette and came across an advertisement for staff for a Campbell Island expedition. On reading through the job description, I reckoned I could handle most of what they required for the position as leader. It seemed pretty straight stuff for someone who kidded himself he was an all-rounder. I thought about it for half an hour or so, then engineered an excuse to go to the post office to collect an official application form, which I filled out and with the required references posted off. I didn't get any acknowledgement from the Civil Aviation Administration and had more or less forgotten about it when some weeks later I was asked to go and meet the local Rotorua Public Service representative. This clown wasted the best part of an hour trying to convince me that my future lay in taking up a clerical job somewhere in the public service.
Oh my gosh.
I pointed out to him that had I wanted a pen pusher's job, I would have asked for one. And this galah quietly had been sucking on his cup of tea all afternoon without offering me one. I'm afraid the discussion got rather heated and I stalked out in disgust. It wasn't till long afterwards I realised the bugger had been baiting me. When the penny finally dropped, I felt a proper nitwit, but at the time I was thoroughly pissed off. I heard nothing from CAA for several weeks and assumed I had dipped out because of my attitude at the local interview. And then, out of the blue, I got a telegram at 3 o'clock one afternoon requesting me to report the following morning at their headquarters in Bunny Street, Wellington, for an interview. This left me momentarily in a state of shock. Rotorua to Wellington in the 50s, presuming one had no car, involved travelling on a train called the Limited Express from Frankton Junction, which meant catching a bus leaving Rotorua at 5 p.m. to connect with the train. I had 2 hours to sort myself out. To complicate matters, the previous week had been socially rugged, and I know what he means by that, and all my gear was in the dry cleaners except for some shorts and casual shirts. Not the sort of apparel for a job interview. And then he goes on and he talks about the journey down to Wellington, where they stopped at Frankton and managed to convince the local publican to sell them a bottle of whiskey so they could drink it on the train. And he met this fellow workmate of his who was going to Wellington as well, and they wrote themselves off on the train and arrived in a terrible state.
Oh,
and he had this interview, and he had borrowed a suit from somebody that he knew, and when he unwrapped it, it had all fallen apart. It was made from some old army cotton, and it had just all fallen apart. So it was. I don't know why he thought he needed a suit to go on an island expedition job, but. So that was quite interesting, and that was just the journey down. And he had the interview. Yeah. And 4 hours later, he had to wait in another room. 4 hours later, he was told he had the job, and he had 4 days to sort himself out and get back to start the training.
Gosh.
So he had to go all the way back to Rotorua on the train and the bus, and leave his job and get back down to Wellington for training.
How exciting. He sounds like a wonderful mix of the straightforward and the adventurous. You know, like... There was some lovely language he used. He stalked out of the office and socially rugged. And he seems very down to earth, but not without an enormous sense of fun. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. He was very dry. I don't ever recall hearing him laugh. Oh. But he had the most wonderful sense of humour.
Yeah.
Very dry. While he was down in Wellington doing the training, they decided to take his appendix out because they thought... in case anything happened down on the island, they might as well get rid of them now to save any problems.
A preemptive strike. Yes. God, I never heard of that.
So they took them out, and he had 9 days recovery, which was what was normal then,
right?
Until they took the stitches out. Ooh. And so on the way home from the hospital, he says here, it just happened to be one of those days, gale force winds and heavy rain, that ignorant outsiders called typically Wellington. I'd finished my stint in casualty, and had planned some nonsense of my own to fill in the evening. Driving along Jervois Quay in the half-dark, the wipers barely coping with the pelting rain, I saw someone waving, so I stopped. It proved to be a thoroughly drenched lady trying to cope with a flat tyre, so I checked to see if the spare was inflated, loosened the wheel nuts, then I asked for the jack. After rummaging around, we found there was none, so I asked her if she could finish off the wheel if I lifted the car. Now, this is on his way home from having his appendix out.
Oh, no.
I backed up to the front bumper and tested the weight, very gingerly for a start, to see how my gut reacted, and then took the strain with no adverse effect. She finished changing the tyre like a pro, and we packed the gear away. By this time, we were like a pair of drowned rats, so she invited me to follow her home and get cleaned up, saying that her hubby was about my size. I tagged along, and sure enough, her old man greeted us at the door with some smart-ass remark. It just shows how a chance encounter works, because 44 years later we're still firm friends.
Oh, that's lovely.
And that's just how tough he was. He was just such a tough man.
He could lift cars after an appendix operation.
Just had his stitches out 2 hours before.
Wow.
So off he went to the island, and the journey down was fairly traumatic because it was a small boat, and there were 11 of them going down for a year.
Wow.
Onto the island.
And they didn't know each other, so they were having to get to know each other on the boat. Yeah.
They had 3 or 4 meteorological guys. They had some carpenters, a cook, and a couple of handymen. Right. And one of the meteorological people was also a medivac, so they needed to have some kind of medical experience down there.
And George was the leader?
George was the leader,
Gosh.
Yeah. He was known as Phil. We always called him Phil, but his name was George.
Do you know why?
No, and his father's name was George, and everyone called him Phil.
Wow.
It was Phil and called him George.
What's your real name? Is it a family tree?
Betty. So they arrived down there on the 15th of December, and a week later was Christmas, and I just want to read you the Christmas menu because they had a pretty good cook. The Christmas menu, the hors d'oeuvres were oyster patties. The main was Campbell Island lamb, in brackets he's got ram. The Campbell Island was settled it was discovered about 1810.
Right.
The man who discovered it consequently drowned in the harbour when his boat capsized. But numerous voyagers called in, and at one stage the French set up a camp there as well, where they were there to study the night sky.
Right.
Farmers went down, and at one stage there was nearly 10,000 sheep on this island that was only 25 miles around the coast.
Gosh.
But it was mainly used for seal hunting. One ship logged, in the early 1800s, logged 30,000 seal skins in 3 years. That's from one ship.
Wow, that's a frightening number, isn't it? Yeah.
When you think of all the other ships that must have been around there, not just New Zealand ships, but other ones as well.
Gosh.
So the main was Campbell Island ram. The vegetables were roast potatoes, carrots, pumpkin, and onions in white sauce. The dessert was Christmas pudding with brandy sauce, mince pies, fruits and nuts. Afters were cigarettes and cigars. And the booze, very important for him, he was a big drinker. Martini, cider, beer, scotch, gin, rum, port, sherry, vermouth and brandy.
Oh, I bet he drank them all as well.
I don't think they would have known Boxing Day at all.
No.
They probably just came and went without. And I don't think any reports of the meteorological weather conditions over Christmas Day probably got through that day.
God, that's a delicious menu, though. It's made me quite peckish, actually.
Yeah, and this little group of men who didn't know each other, there they were having this Christmas dinner away from their families. He was married then, so
right. What did Mrs. Poppleton think? Do you know?
No. She just agreed with it, I think.
Got on.
Even when he came back, he had odd jobs. He went off and cooked for a shearing gang for a couple of years, and he was away for months at a time. And
such an adaptable chap.
Yeah, he was a bit of a loner.
Yeah.
He says here, we had a few luxury items that needed to be rationed. Of these, each cook could use one during his week on duty. Forrester had a yen for salmon fish cake, so he rang his girlfriend in New Zealand and got a recipe, and we were treated to these on the Sunday, his last day of cooking. He was up early and started on the fish cakes as soon as he'd sent off his weather report to Wellington. Eventually the smell permeated the hostel. Everyone made the effort, and we were all up sitting at the table waiting. Dave Jr. was the first to eat. He took his first bite, but he promptly spat it out. Forrester, fumbling around in the dark passage, had got into the icing sugar instead of the flour.
Oh,
So
what a shame.
they had all gone, thrown out.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
This other little bit I want to read is just the little antics they got up to. They were bits of characters and had to create their own entertainment. So this is Midsummer's Day, the 20th of June, and they were having a meal. We had sent and received messages from head office, Scott Base, Cape Adare, Macquarie and Heard Island, and also had a request from New Zealand Antarctic Society to give them a call at their celebratory dinner at the Miramar Golf Course in Wellington on the Sunday. There was a fair amount of hilarity, and well-worn personal jokes got a further airing with much laughter. Bill co-opted our rooster and gave a demonstration of hypnosis in poultry. The chook cooperated for a while and then eventually disappeared, to be discovered when Bob Thompson located it under his bed when he crashed. The poor bloody thing had been sick. Bob performed a bit, so I cleaned up the mess rather than have any further ruckus. While all this was going on, the bloody bird went missing again. At some stage, Peter and Bill decided to go over to Tucker Camp to round up the day. They found some sleeping bags and with a bit of food disappeared into the night. The next morning I woke early and the first thing I saw was the bloody rooster. It had camped on my bookcase and crapped on the bristles of my only remaining unused toothbrush. And the final little bit I'd just love to read.
Yeah.
and this is again to do with the kitchen. Cookie discovered a partial defrost in the freezers and had to heave 20 porterhouse steaks to the dogs. They had 2 dogs. My uncle had one called Flash, and there was an old dog called Hans. So he had to throw these 20 porterhouse steaks to the dogs. He was a bit upset as he'd kept them hidden for a special occasion. The dogs, not used to such largesse, got wired into them. The Met boys were watching and saw Flash dispose 14 of them and tow off another 5 for future use. Poor old toothless Hans was still managing to gnaw his way through the one he had started on. One of the guys took pity on the old dog, retrieved the ones Flash had buried, sliced them up into small pieces and fed them to Hans on the sly.
Oh. Yeah. Do you know if he kept diaries in order to write this book?
I think he must have, because the detail in here is,
It's incredible.
And this was written like less than 20 years ago.
Do you know if he took much convincing to write a book?
Well, he never wanted to write it. His son just said, Dad, you have to, because he probably spent more time there. There were 3 expeditions, and he was the only one, or 3 expeditions that he was at, and he was the only one that was at all 3. Every time he went down, he had a different team with him.
Yeah. And did he stay friends with those teams? Yeah. I bet he was great to work with.
I can't say it's an enjoyable book to read. It's fascinating, but I think because of the connection, and I just hear him.
Yes, I can imagine.
When I read him, that's how he speaks.
Yes.
And
but that detail, as you say, it really is a window on that world at that specific time, which is such a treat to have.
And lots of pictures.
Oh, great!
Which
he took.
Yes.
Oh, of
and
seals,
sketches,
the remaining ones.
And even like a map of the island with all the details and things. There's a lot of research had gone into it, as well as his own personal.
So he was reluctant, but he did a great job.
Yeah, he did. Yeah. So that's lovely. My mother never read it because she didn't like swear words. My mother was a real lady, and she just found the swear words a bit much for her.
Yeah, but they're all part and parcel of him, aren't they? They come through,
They were chalk and cheese.
Yeah.
But they shared the same mother and father, but that always happens in families, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's one of my prides.
Well, I love that. And we can find that in the library.
It's in the library, Campbell Island by George Poppleton.
Wonderful. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. And you read beautifully as well, which is always a treat.
Thank you.
So it's 3:17. I'm going to use a song to introduce our next book. Let me have a look. Oh, it's disappeared. So this is usually what happens to me. So I've been reading this book called Gentleman Jack, and it's a biography of Anne Lister based on her diaries. And Anne Lister was, what was she called? She was an entrepreneur, but I've got a great way of describing her. Not one that I came up with, unfortunately, but an article I found on the Guardian website. A gender non-conforming entrepreneur living in the mid-1800s, and she was, that's when she was the height of her powers. She inherited an estate. She was from a wealthy family, and she wrote 26 volumes of diaries. She started when she was about 25. These diaries were kind of deliberately hidden by various members of her family, because once they started to decipher the diaries, a good chunk of which are written in code, they realised that it was very intimate details of her sexual encounters, and she was a voracious lover of women. And so she broke all kinds of stereotypes. And it's such an interesting window on Victorian England. And her character is so familiar and also so fascinating. And we think, when I'm reading about Anne Lister, I'm hearing her voice through her diaries, just that kind of the chutzpah. I think she would have got on with your uncle, to be honest. They would have been out. She was a huge traveller. She travelled all around Russia and Europe with her wife, and she did have a wife. It wasn't a traditional church service, but they did kind of tie the knot in their own way, and just an incredible woman, kind of bursting through all the stuffy conformity of Victorian life. And so it's currently, I will read from it in a minute, but it's currently a show on BBC, so it will be coming to New Zealand soon. And the actress is Saran Jones, and she plays her to a T. When I imagine this woman in my head, I just think, you need somebody gutsy and so, similar kind of writing in a way, lots of detail. Towards the end of her life, her diaries became a bit obsessive, and she was even writing a diary. You know, she kind of got into that kind of headspace. But I think, again, her and George would have had lots to talk about because they were both great observers of their world and could see their... and were great influencers as well, great leaders of people. And Anne Lister was particularly a great leader when it came to managing her estate.
So was this around the same time as Oscar Wilde then?
Yes, it would have been, yes. Oscar Wilde, and I'm just reading about John Ruskin and the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, so it was around that time as well. So when kind of the puffy sleeves of the Victorian era and all that went with it was at its height, you know, and Queen Victoria wasn't quite the sourpuss she was later on to become. And so, you know, interesting, there was this kind of great female role model or ruler of Britain. And I think, you know, there were more of these types of women hidden in history than we know, you know.
Not a modern thing, is it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The other thing is that it's written by a German academic. And so it's been translated and the translation is impeccable. I wasn't aware that it was translated at all. It felt very, very English. You know, the writing was spot on.
Yeah.
So I'm going to play the theme tune to the show because it's great and the words are awesome to this particular record. So here we go.
Behind her back, she's Gentleman Jack, a Yorkshire lady of renown. Never so fine, won't toe the line, speak her name, gentleman frown. With shipped and all, she had them all. The fairest sex fell under a spell. Dapper and bright, she held them tight. Handsome man seduced them well. Gentleman Jack, oh Gentleman Jack, watch your back, you're under attack. The husbands are coming, you better start running, for nobody likes a Jack the Lass. Jack the Lass, Jack the Lass, no one likes a Jack the Lass. The code is cracked, your bags are packed, the knives are out for Gentleman Jack. She played the fellas at the game. Sharp of mind, she's one of a kind. Devilish ways that men couldn't tame. Hidden away, revealed today. Loaded words in diaries found. Once exposed in a baffling code. Lusty letters all ever bound. Gentleman Jack, oh Gentleman Jack, watch your back, you're under attack. The husbands are coming, you better start running, for nobody likes a Jack the Lass. Jack the Lass, Jack the Lass, no one likes a Jack the Lass. The code is cracked, your bags are packed, the knives are out for Gentleman Jack. Gentleman Jack.
It's such a great tune.
Very catchy tune, isn't it?
Very catchy.
Lovely.
So that's O'Hooley and Tidale are the names of the artists who did the theme track for Gentleman Jack. And she was called Gentleman Jack very unkindly by all the people who lived around her in Halifax. So she was a very prominent woman in Halifax. Halifax, being in the north of England, would have been a very conservative place, coal mining area. And she just kind of broke all the rules. But it's really well worth reading this book just to kind of get an alternative insight into how women who didn't conform navigated that role, navigated that space in that society. Because actually, women's relationships, the Victorians, and this is discussed in this book, Victorians highly prized virginity. You know, it was like the gold standard. And so many Victorian families encouraged women to have quite close relationships with other women, because if they were with other women, they weren't with other men.
Right.
And so consequently, forming these close relationships was relatively quite straightforward, but then keeping it under wraps outside of the bedroom or outside of the house was more difficult, particularly if you were Anne Lister, because she didn't want to keep quiet about it. She was who she was. So I'm just going to read very briefly. I'll just read a paragraph from a chapter called Callista, which was the nickname for one of Anne's many lovers, and she had many. And some parts of her diary are in here. So she quote from her diary: "I cannot live happily without female company. Mariana, who was probably her first serious lover after a series of lovers when she was at school, remained out of reach, and Isabella was travelling." That was another one. Anne noticed the 23-year-old Miss Elizabeth Brown at scientific lectures. I quote from the diaries: "Having all the 4 preceding nights admired Miss Brown, on the 5th evening she deliberately sat just before her, handed her several things to look at, and contrived to get into conversation with her after the lecture was over. The lecture being longer than usual, and I staying a good while afterwards to look at the apparatus, or rather at Miss Brown, did not get home till near 11. No, this is the author now. "During the next night, Anne did nothing but dream of Miss Brown, and though I woke at 6, yet had no resolution to get up, but lay dozing and thinking of the fair charmer. She is certainly very pretty. She seemed evidently not displeased with my attention, and I felt all possible inclination to be as foolish as ever I was in former days. The next evening, Anne sat directly behind Miss Brown and engaged her in another conversation after the lecture." Quote from the diary: "She evidently seems flattered. My attention to Miss Brown has been pointed these last 2 nights, and I wonder if anyone has observed it." And that's the delightful thing about her diaries. Nothing escaped her notice. She would spend hours of an evening. She'd write notes all day while she was out and about, and then transcribe those into her diary, and then add more detail. And then she detailed every single sexual encounter in code, including Greek, algebra, and her own code that she came up with. Just a fascinating woman who lived this incredibly packed, wonderful life. And you just want to know more about these women, because there'd be hundreds of,
she had no trouble finding anyone, so there must have been rife.
Definitely. And she was a skillful, she was skillful at seduction, a very skillful, and also had enough charm to get through the initial, because she dressed differently from other women. She wore black, kind of highly tailored, still wore skirts, but it was definitely of the masculine kind of persuasion, with top hats, just looked stunning. And but she was confronting to kind of the older generation who were, all looking for eligible men for their daughters, but she had just enough charm and chutzpah to kind of get through those initial barriers. And then, she was very skillful at kind of just upsetting the whole pack.
And women just fell for her.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they did. They did.
It wasn't so much a pursuit as a...
Oh, she did. She could go for the pursuit. I mean, there were some of the women that are documented in this book which were definitely not going to fall for it, but were quite excited by her intellect and her interests. I mean, she was a huge traveller. She was a businesswoman. So for other women trapped within the conformist, society ideals, would have found her very either alarming or alluring, or a mixture of both. And I think the book does a really great job of tying together all the translations of the diary. There are several, so I think 5 scholars have had a good go at translating and decoding the diaries. So she does a great job of trying to draw that together with her own commentary. And very, very, if you like biography, if you like history, then definitely, if you like the Victorian era, definitely have a delve in, because it's a fascinating read.
And what age did she live to?
She wasn't terribly old, mid-50s, I think. She died of typhus, I think, abroad, and so her poor wife had to bring her back in a carriage through the hot summer. Oh, it took forever. And then her wife, in the end, ended up being put into an asylum. Yeah. Interestingly, Anne Lister's first lover and her last both ended up in the same mental asylum.
Wow.
Yeah. There's some
big backstories.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, exactly. And you want to delve into the stories of all these women, but Anne Lister is just a great entry level to this alternative, not alternative, but this other way that Victorian life was being lived. Really incredible.
And Sir Anne Jones, I can just imagine what she's going to be like. I can't wait to see it.
Well, I'm in love with her already. It's
she's
ridiculous.
Fantastic, isn't
yeah,
it?
she is
So,
amazing.
so Anne Lister's already casting her spell.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah. You kind of get to the end and you think, I just want to know more. And what a shame she didn't live till she was in a ripe old age. We have to go.
I know.
Isn't
It
it?
was quick.
It was. It is quick. This 30 minutes just goes in a flash,
It was lovely.
But thank you so much, Graham.
great fun.
So that was Campbell Island by your uncle,
Yep.
George Poppleton, and Gentleman Jack, a biography of Anne Lister by Angela Steedley. I'm sorry if I didn't mention the author before. She's a German author, translated into English. Brilliant. This has been Bookworms. So there'll be a new episode in 2 weeks' time. And
Me again.
And you again with
Marilyn.
Marvellous. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And see you
Lovely.
again, Graham.
Thank you, Lucy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.